Okay, hi everybody. Should I stand behind here? Is that more helpful for people to hear? So welcome to this workshop. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper on collective impact. And so I'm Liz Weaver. I'm from the Tamarack Institute in Canada. That's me in front of a really cool mural in Waterloo, Ontario. That is a mural about community inclusivity and all the newcomers that have moved into Waterloo, Ontario. So this is a workshop in actually a couple of parts. So the first part is to talk about the collective impact framework in a little bit more detail and to share with you some stories of where collective impact is being utilized by communities in Canada and the United States. And then the second half of the workshop is really focusing on a couple of tools that you can use if you're working in a collective impact mindset, or even if you're working in collaboration. These are tools that will be helpful to you, and tools that are particularly helpful for collective impact work. So you heard about Tamarack this morning, so I'll skip by that one. Our goals are really to introduce you a little bit more deeply to the concepts behind collective impact, the preconditions and the 5 conditions of collective impact, to look at some resources and tools around this, to build your knowledge, and then to really apply it in terms of the work that you're doing. So, I'm going to start off with your knowledge of collective impact. Want to see what we have in the room. So how many of you would think that you might be the first person? Oh my goodness, everybody's talking about collective impact. I don't want to hear about it. It's one more framework, and you know, I have enough on my plate already. How many of you would be at the example of that first person? Oh, good. So how many of you are the center person? Heard a little bit about it, interested in it, want to dive in a little bit deeper? Okay, most of us in the room. And then finally, I love it, I work in it, I have a lot of experience. So a couple of you have that. So great, that's really helpful to me. When we talk about collective impact at Tamarack, we actually step one step back from collective impact and we think about, okay, so where is this framework most useful? Right, and so these are grounding ideas that, you know, even before you engage with collective impact, you should kind of give these some thoughts. And the first grounding idea is one that we uncovered a number of years ago called the collaboration spectrum. And so we love this because, you know, there are those of us that sit around collaborative tables and we've never had the conversation about what is it that we want to accomplish together. Are we here to share information and communicate? Are we here to coexist? Are we here to compete? Or are we here actually to intentionally collaborate, coordinate our activities, and maybe even integrate our programs and services? And so collaboration happens on a spectrum. And the first and early work that you should be doing is actually getting agreement around your collaborative table about where do you think you might be on that spectrum. Now, there are 2 pieces of additional information about this spectrum. If you're just about competing, so I don't think this happens in Tasmania, but I know it happens in Hamilton. Sometimes you have people at your table and their agenda is to compete, right? They want to know how come you got the money for that project and I need to get some of that money myself. So that's their agenda and that's why they've joined the collaboration. Well, at that end of the spectrum, this end of the spectrum, when it is a highly competitive environment, the organizations are more loosely coupled together and there's far more degrees of turf. As you start to move along the spectrum, as you begin to say, no, we're going to coordinate our activities, we're going to actually collaborate more intentionally, we're going to work maybe even to integration of programs and services or shared programs and services. Look at the trust triangle. The trust triangle deepens quite significantly. They say, well, Stephen Covey said that collaboration grows at the speed of trust. And so you've got to pay attention to not only what is the end game of your collaborative effort, what do you want to ultimately achieve together, but also how are you going to build trustful relationships with the folks that are sitting around your collaborative table. Collective impact sits within that kind of red circle. So it is where we are more intentionally collaborating together, where we're saying, yeah, we're going to work on a common agenda and we're really going to pay attention to it. So the collaboration spectrum can be a tool. We have it, if you go to the Tamarack website, you'll see that not only do we talk about it this way, but we use it as a tool. We were doing some work in Red Deer, Alberta, and there were about 9 different collaborative efforts in the room. They weren't all collective impact efforts, but there were things like a bunch of folks working on early years, another group of folks working on the homelessness agenda, another group of folks working on economic development. So 9 different collaborations in the room. They blew up the collaboration spectrum and they gave everybody who was with a different collaborative group a different colored dot. And they asked the individuals to place their dots on the collaboration spectrum. What do you think happened? Sorry? They were in different places, yeah. So I see that as a really great opportunity for a conversation. Even though your dots may be in different places, you know, what does that mean for our shared work? About a year and a half later, I was back in Red Deer, Alberta, and they brought the collaboration spectrum again. The same groups were in the room, but in the case of, you know, a year and a half later, some of the leadership had changed. Some of the groups had moved forward. They did the same exercise. Where's your collaboration on the collaboration spectrum? And some of them were in the same place. They hadn't made very much progress. Others had made progress, and some of them had moved behind, right? Had moved back a little bit. And that's okay too, because what it says is let's reaffirm where we go. So thinking about collective impact work, where is either your collective impact work or your collaboration on this spectrum? What are you trying to achieve together? And how do you have a conversation about it? The other thing that we know as a contextual issue around collective impact is that it is best suited for complex problems, right? And so we see collective impact initiatives evolving across a whole variety of domains, as I said this morning, and here are some examples. But complex problems have a number of different characteristics, but the best way to describe a complex problem is how do you raise children, right? Children, the whole way that you raise children it actually has many of the conditions of complexity in it. The rules and the strategies and the interventions that you have with one of the children in your family are probably going to look very different with the other children that you have in your family, because each child is unique, each child has their own personality, they come up in a different kind of birth order, and even your skills and competencies as parents evolve and shift over time. And so think about, you know, the work that you're doing. How complex is this work? Does it have lots of partners involved? Are the individual circumstances of the folks that are engaged in the problem, are they unique? What are the things that you have to pay attention to? And it really is important to think about, you know, the different kinds of problems that we face in our communities. Simple problems, you would follow a best practice recipe like baking a cake. Complicated problems are like sending a man to the moon. We can do it, but we need a lot of technical expertise to bring to the table. With complex problems, we really need lots of individuals with lots of different experiences informing the work that we do. And that's where collective impact is best suited. Here are some more characteristics of complex problems. So each experience is unique, and even as you begin to intervene, even as we begin to say, okay, we're going to collectively work on every child succeeds, the community begins to respond to that, right? And so some people will step up to the plate and say, yeah, I'm in, and I'm going to do things differently. And other folks that you thought might be, you know, your early partners might walk away from the table. And so that's what makes it complex, is that you've always got to be looking at, okay, as we begin to do things, how is the community responding, and what are we learning as we go? So it's a little bit of a collective impact is in many ways a learn as you go kind of approach. So now we're going to get into the meat of collective impact. I put this video up, the link to this video up, but I'm not going to show you the video because I'm a little afraid of technology sometimes. This is a really good video if you're wanting to talk about collective impact in your organizations. It really is, it's a 3-minute video, and it really focuses on this approach as a way of moving the needle on big complex issues or climbing mountains together. So I put up the URL link for you. So what is collective impact? It's really a disciplined cross-sector approach to trying to move community change forward. So it's really looking at how do we intentionally, in Launceston and in the Tamar Valley, how do we intentionally work together in a disciplined kind of way to make sure that every child succeeds. That's really the motivation behind collective impact at a larger scale. So it's more than individual programs and services. We're trying to affect systems change. You saw this slide this morning. I talked about the preconditions. I wanted to, these I think are really important, and I want you to maybe have a quick little conversation at your tables. Of these 3 preconditions, influential champions, urgency of the issue, and adequate resources, what's the most challenging if you were to move the needle for every child and their family at risk here in this region? What's the most challenging of these 3 preconditions? We did this yesterday, so for those of you that were here yesterday, it's going to be a little bit of a repeat conversation, but you have different people at your table. If you only have a couple of people at your table, if you want to join another table and have a bigger conversation, we only have 1 person here. Go ahead. So 5 minutes. Which of the preconditions is most challenging?
From my perspective and my involvement, and I don't know where this fits in with the preconditions. In your opening remarks, you talked about this
Are we changing?
but not in Tasmania.
Okay.
And we're hiding from that. And the government, yeah, but even what they're doing now is increasing competitiveness. So for me, what I would see as a precondition is something around willingness to actually act in a way that reduces competition and increases competitiveness. Right now, paradoxically, they're being promoted side by side. And I'm looking at Louise, she's a representative of DSA. So we have this paradox. On the one hand, collective impact's a big thing. On the other hand, increasing competition is a way of increasing capacity and efficiency of the NGO sector.
A matter of inadequate resources, though.
Well, it could be.
Is that a byproduct of not having enough adequate funding for the things that we'd like to do? Or is that competition going to be there regardless of whether
See, I see it as a philosophical thing, but I don't know where you put it.
I'm not saying that one's that's the way to look at it, but so there's limited resources and the fund fights that go on with that. What follows on from that is this proprietary nature around even data or sharing ideas. I've gotten this money. I've put hard work in it. I'm going to keep what I've learned in the organization. I'm not going to share it. I mean, even though that's what we're doing here, in many cases, that kind of very existing.
Okay, folks. So who landed on influential champions, that it's very difficult to recruit the influential champions to the table? You can either put as a table or you can put up your individual hands. Okay, not too many. Oh, that's good. What about urgency of the issue? Okay, your table and a couple others in the room. And what about adequate resources? Yeah, so others, yeah. And who said, and for those of you that were here yesterday probably know the answer, who said that it's a combination of 2 or 3 of these, that it's not just one of them, that, you know, sometimes they are interrelated, and that's absolutely true. You know, if we get influential champions to the table, they will bring resources with them, or they'll uncover pathways to resources, right? Or they'll say, you know, we could maybe lend this gift in kind or this service in kind to the entity. It really is important to kind of pay attention to the preconditions of collective impact. We used the framing questions this morning, so I'm not going to spend I'm not going to spend any time on these, but they are really important questions to ask your collective impact efforts. And I talked about the 5 conditions this morning, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go more slowly through each of the conditions and share with you some examples of how that condition has worked out for community change efforts. So the first one is common agenda, and here are the elements that you have to pay attention to when you're developing a common agenda. And it's really, you know, what is the issue, and then what are we agreeing to that we will be working together on in common, and what are the values and principles that will really drive our work together. And you know, it's interesting, there are lots of times where collective impact initiatives hit bumps in the road, and they usually hit bumps in the road because they haven't actually articulated their own values and principles. And they actually can't pull that out of their side pocket and say, well, you know, we thought that we would be here for the longer term and that we were looking at root causes. Whatever those values and principles are, that's important work to be doing. So here's an example of a community effort and their common agenda. This is ShapeUp Somerville. This is a US-based collective impact initiative that takes place in Somerville, Massachusetts. And what's really interesting about this is that they started to say, okay, so what's our problem? Well, we know that 46% of our kids are overweight and obese in Somerville, and we know that despite all the programs that we have across our community to try and address this issue, we're actually not moving the needle on this issue, and so we need to take a different kind of approach. And so what they started to do was to look at, okay, so what's our common agenda? How are we going to frame this in a way that people will both understand, adults and children will understand what we're trying to do and actually actively get involved in the behavior change that we're hoping for, so that we can actually begin to turn the curve for children and their families who are overweight and obese. And so their common agenda had 3 shared goals, and the shared goals are pretty straightforward kind of shared goals if you're dealing with the issue of overweight and obesity in your community. And one is to get more active, the other one is around food, and the other one is really looking at the community infrastructure. Does our community have the right kind of infrastructure so that kids can walk to school, so that kids feel that they're safe, that there are cycling opportunities for kids in our community? And so it actually, their work centered around these 3 kind of key strategies that were driving their work forward, and they actually targeted specific stakeholder groups to get engaged in this work. So they targeted municipal government, they targeted schools and in-school and out-of-school environments, they targeted government, and they actually even reached out to the business community, and particularly to restaurants across Somerville, that they could begin to identify on their restaurant menus those healthy choice options for kids and their families. And there's a great video about the work of ShapeUp Somerville. They've really taken a whole community approach, and it's been quite transformative. What I love about this is actually quite similar to Nigel's one plan, one page, right? You can see on this one page how they're trying to tackle this really complex issue of obesity and where community partners can play a role in this. The second condition, shared measurement. Shared measurement is one thing. Learning and sense making from your progress as you go is the second really important feature of shared measurement. So here's an example. This is the Halton Our Kids Network. So the Halton Our Kids Network is actually a regional collaboration of a lot of different service providers and community members in Halton Region. Halton Region is 4 different municipalities. 2 of them are highly urban, 1 is rural, and 1 is kind of a mixed community that's growing like Topsy. So Oakville, Burlington, Georgetown, and Milton. Georgetown is the rural community. And so it's actually a really large footprint and quite diverse municipalities that are involved. Their key mission is that all children thrive in Halton Region. And how do they know whether children are thriving or not? They have indicators which they call the Halton 7. These are their 7 core indicators. They have a number of programs. They use a lot of data to inform those indicators, and they have a number of programs that their partners lead out on. The Halton Our Kids Network is very much a collective impact approach. One of the really exciting things that they did was they said, okay, so we've produced these annual progress reports on whether children are thriving, and yeah, you know, they get out to a certain number of the people across our four our municipalities, but it's actually not open access. What happens if we were actually to create a data portal? And so they worked with their partners. They were able to secure some funding, about $300,000, which, you know, can be a substantial amount of funding, but not that much actually. And then they went to their partners and they said, okay, for the Halton 7, will you be willing to contribute your data on a regular basis to, you know, so that we can populate the data portal and so that we can share across our whole community how kids are doing and what would that look like. And so this is an example of one of the elements of their data portal. If you want to see how kids are doing in terms of grade 3 reading, it's an educational marker that the school boards agreed to share with the Halton Our Kids Network. So you can see how kids are doing across the various neighborhoods. There are 27 different neighborhoods across the Halton region. The darker the blue, the less well those kids are doing. The lighter blue, the better those kids are doing. What has happened since they've had their data portal up and running, and the other element of the data portal is that actually you can look at trends over time. So are the Halton 7 markers doing better or worse over time? Since they've had this data open access, they've really actually seen things happen in the community differently. So the library runs a reading program and an after-school program. The library, for example, said, well, I was going to put my reading program in that lighter blue neighborhood, but maybe they don't need it. Maybe it's better positioned in one of the darker blue neighborhoods. And so the partners sitting around the table, since they have access to this data, are actually making decisions about where their programs and services should be, where they have the greatest impact. The other element of the data, one of the subsets of data that they use is that on a 3-year rotation, they do surveys, right? So they'll do surveys of kids in grade 6, they'll do surveys of kids in grade 12, and then they do a parent survey. And they do that on a 3-year rotation, and that's one of the indicators around, you know, do children feel healthy? Do they feel secure? Do they feel safe? And so that data also is populated on the Our Kids Network. They no longer produce an annual report. They also invite their partners to contribute their own data. So if the YMCA is running programs in the community, that data is also populating this data portal. Now, you know, it took them a while. It took them 1.5 years to get their data portal up and running, but it has been transformative in the work that they're doing in Halton Region. So this is shared measurement in real time. Mutually reinforcing activities, that's the 3rd condition of collective impact. That's leveraging all the good that's really going on in the community. And sometimes it's orchestrated, sometimes it's multiple partners coming together, and sometimes it's individual. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples around mutually reinforcing activities. This is ShapeUp Somerville. Remember that they've subsetted their work into, you know, before school, after school, that kind of thing. What they've done is they begin to see, you know, in the after school hours, in the before school hours, these are the kinds of activities that we hope to see. These are how our partners are going to contribute. So I love it. Again, it's a really easy and accessible way of showing mutually reinforcing activities. Continuous communications is again another great collective impact condition. You can see the elements here so that difficult issues are surfaced and discussed, right? You know, we sometimes go to these collaborative tables and, you know we don't have any funding to carry on this work, but we keep at it, hoping that the funding will come. Well, you know, if that were the case at a table I was sitting at, that would be an issue I'd want to discuss, right? Why aren't we getting funding? What are some of the barriers? What would it take for us to do this work in a different kind of way? So that's a critical element of continuous communication. Here's an example of an organization. This is a rural initiative, Headwaters Community in Action, that's based in Ontario, Canada. So they did a big community survey and they came up with 9 different priority areas that the community could work on. There were things that we would normally see in every community. We can work on poverty, we can work on economic development, we can work on all these kinds of things. When they took that back to their community and they had a meeting of about 200 people in their community, the community said, you know, really, to be truthful, our community doesn't have a very good history of working together. And so yes, we could work on poverty, but that's a really complex issue that would really stretch us, and we're not sure if we have the resources there. So let's do something very tangible and concrete in the short term. Let's work on trails. They had 8 or 9 different trails across their community. They were fragmented. Nobody was really supporting trails. The trails were being run down. They were, all worked by volunteers. And if you were to ask the municipal leaders in the community, they would say, well, no, trails are not very important to us. But the citizens of the community felt like they could all get behind trails and that they could actually do something about it. And so when they thought about continuous communications, they thought about things like, let's have meetings on the trails. And so you can see the picture of people having meetings on the trails, taking the citizens to the trails and having meetings there. They started to put together trail guides. Look at all the different trails that we have in our community and what's happening on these trails and linking the trails together. And then they got some funding, a little bit of funding, I think it was under $50,000, to buy trail counters. And so at the beginning of a trail and at the end of the trail, every time someone walked or cycled the trails, they started to count the number of people that did that. And lo and behold, they found out that people were using their trails far more than they even imagined, right? Across the 8 trails, they were getting people, 150, 200,000 people coming to their community, because their community was relatively small. It was a community with a population of less than 60,000, kind of over a very large and spread out region. And so they said, well, there's something about our trails, and they did interviews on the trails to find out who were the users, who were some of the people profiled on the trails. Then they took that data and they decided, we got to make an economic case for the importance of these trails to our community. And they took that data and they looked at health data that was out there, and they said, well, for every kilometer of trail that someone walks or cycles, it's a 4.5%, or is it 4.5 or 40? No, 45-cent savings on healthcare costs. So we can actually make this direct contribution, because that's what Heart and Stroke and other healthcare providers were saying. So they used the notion of continuous communications to really boost their message and create a narrative that actually got people paying attention to this trail system. And the work on trails actually led to deeper work in the community. So they were able to really make some significant progress on something very tangible, and now they're working on economic development opportunities and food security opportunities in their community. So it's really interesting to think about how one thing leads to another. Backbone infrastructure is the final condition. Backbones have 6 things that they have to pay attention to, and they're quite closely related to the core conditions of collective impact, but the backbone, the infrastructure of the backbone, really holds the space for the collective impact work to go forward. Because all of us are really busy. We've got all of our own organizational agendas at play, but we want to play a role in this collective impact work. And so the backbone is the group that convenes us all together. The backbone is the group that sees where there are policy opportunities or gets people engaged in how we think about shared measurement and some of the continuous communication elements. So some of the lessons that we've learned about backbones, particularly in the collective impact context, is that they are absolutely important to this work. And so much collaborative work happens without the resources of a backbone, and sometimes the energy kind of dissipates. And so I would say, it's a harder conversation to have with funders. Funders are often really excited about funding collective impact, but not necessarily the backbone elements of it, right? The shared measurement they love. They love the common agenda part. They might even love mutually reinforcing activities, maybe a little less about backbone, but it's so critical for this work to move forward. There are also misperceptions about backbones, right? That it is that backbone, if you're stepping up into the backbone role, that it's, you've got to think about how is this agenda, this community held agenda, different from my own organization held agenda. Okay, so here's I think a really cool example of collective impact in action. This is an initiative called Erie Together, Erie, Pennsylvania. Now, Erie Together, Erie was written up in the newspaper as the community in Pennsylvania that was the worst, right? It's not unlike the child-friendly lead story. And so they decided that they were going to really focus on children and youth in their communities. And so they formed this kind of broad table called Erie Together. The reason why I'm showing it, it's actually kind of a unique approach to collective impact. They have 3 priorities that they're working on, the Learn, Work, and Thrive priority, and we're going to spend a bit of time diving deep into the Learn priority. I love this. I love how they talk about themselves. They don't talk about themselves as another project or program, but they are a county-wide civic movement, which I love. I mean, it really kind of reframes collective impact work. So there are their 3 priorities again. In the Learn priority, they actually identified this pathway for success for the children in Erie, Pennsylvania. And there are 4 steps that they identified on their pathway. The first step is that children are entering school ready to learn. The second step is that they're reading at a proficiency level in grade 3. The third step is that they have, by grade 8, that they have career opportunities explored with all the children and youth. The next step is around high school, and that all leads to children being successful and thriving in Erie, Pennsylvania. When they looked around their community, they said, okay, so this is the pathway, but we don't have a lot of resources in Erie, Pennsylvania to do something about all of these steps along the pathway. So really, we've got to choose one, because if we look around the tables, that's all the resources that we have. So they had to make a choice. Which of these 4 steps do you think they chose? The early learning one? Okay. Anybody else think of any other ones? That might be a place that you think. In fact, they chose 3rd grade reading. And they said, we're going to pick 3rd grade reading. We know that the folks in high school might not be happy about it. The early learning folks might not be happy about it. But as we look at the evidence, there's a reason why we're picking 3rd grade reading. And so you can start, they called it their keystone outcome. But you can see, they said, we know that if we focus on 3rd grade reading, there's a cohort effect, right? Kids in grade 2, kids in grade 4, children in grade 5, if they can read proficiently at grade 3, they're going to carry it with them. We also know that those children that read proficiently at grade 3, the data tells us and the research tells us that they're 6 times less likely to get involved in criminal justice, that they're healthy, that they're kids that are going to have less teen pregnancies come out of this. They really did a lot of analysis around a lot of research reports that said by focusing on 3rd grade reading, we can have these kinds of impacts in the community. The three-colored wheel on the one side of the slide shows you the United States as a whole. And so you can see that children that are below basic are 33%. Children that are reading at basic and third grade are at 33%. And those that are proficient and successful reading at third grade are at 34%. That's for the United States as a whole. In Erie, Pennsylvania, the numbers look way different after only 3 years. By really taking their resources and saying, yeah, there's lots of things we could do around this pathway, but we're actually going to be very tightly focused on outcomes along this pathway. They actually have been able to get 75% of children in Erie, Pennsylvania reading at third grade or proficient levels. And you can just imagine the ripple effect that that's going to have across their community over the course of the next number of years. Okay, that was a quick kind of overview of collective impact, and we're running out of time. So we're going to take maybe one of these tools and put it into practice. We're going to start with the Top 100 Partner Tool. This is a tool that we use a lot at Tamarack. So it's going to mean, I hope that you all have, someone at your table has some paper that they're willing to share, at least one piece of paper. Or you can use the paper in the middle of the table. How's that? Because it is a piece of paper as well. We want you to draw this grid and brainstorm if we're trying to move the needle for every child succeeds here in this work. Who are the top 100 people that we need to get involved in this work? So start to brainstorm those names. Okay, using this grid. Who from business, who from government, who's citizens, citizens, it might be the local news presenter or someone in the media. Who are the people that we need to get involved? See how many names you can brainstorm in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Names, or if you don't know the exact person's name, think about the organization. So we need local government at the table, or we need, what is the church here? We need the Church of Hope at the table because they have a big network of people that they're connected to. So we're going to give you 3 minutes to come up with as many names as you can collectively around your table. Do you understand? Everybody get it?
Those people that provide counselling and family therapy.
Yeah, I mean there are some. But
Relationship Australia.
Volunteering charity.
And also, do we have like Glenhaven or any out-of-home care sort of organisation down?
Remember how in Leeds they had like their sport club, heroes, and things like that?
These ones clearly blank at the moment. She was using the example before of media, so maybe another paper, or if there's regional papers. So Fairfax probably covers most of them.
Okay, we have 1 more minute for this part. We're going to go through this at a rapid pace. Okay, folks, how many names did you come up with at your table? So how many of you came up with 5 or less names? No? How about 5 to 10, 6 to 10 names? Or 6 to 10 folks identified? How about, who came up with more than 10? Yeah. Look at that. In a very short period of time, using your collective wisdom, you can brainstorm a lot of names. And so you can use this no matter what work you're doing in community, and you say, okay, so we want to actually move something. Let's have a conversation about who are the people that we want to get involved in this work, or who need to be involved in this work. There's a second stage to this work, and so what we generally have people do is we ask them to take one of the more challenging names, and this is called the engagement cycle. And the engagement cycle has 5 parts to it. The first part is, what do we know about that individual? So for example, if you had the mayor as one of the folks on your list, what do you know about the mayor? If you're trying to move the needle on, child-friendly work or on Every Child Succeeds, does the mayor have children? Are they interested in children? What are they talking about? So what do we know about that individual? The second part is, what would we ask them to do? Right? So it's not that we're, going to say, okay, you got to somehow be involved in Every Child Succeeds. We want to be relatively specific about what we want to ask them to do. So what is it? Do we want them to be a champion? Do we want them to speak about this initiative? Do we want them to lend staff support to this initiative? So to be really intentional about that. So what is the ask? The third really important part in the engagement cycle is, who's going to do it? What's the activity to actually reach out to that person, right? So is it that we need to have one of their council colleagues sit down with them? Do we need a local business leader to communicate the message, take them out for lunch? Is this person a person that sits in coffee shops a lot? Do we meet them in a coffee shop? So how are we going to actually make that ask happen? What's the materials that we need to have in place to make that ask be successful? It's about the intentionality. The final thing, or the fourth thing, is, how will we know that we've been successful? What is this individual going to do differently that shows that we've had an impact on them, right? So if, for example, we want the mayor to identify a key staff person to be involved with our initiative, we'll know we're successful when we get that key staff person involved in our work, right? And so it's really thinking that through. And then the final piece, and I think actually the most critical piece of the engagement cycle, is how do we steward that relationship over time? So it's not just a one-off, that we are continually looking at that person. If that person is truly a pivotal person to this work, that we are continuing to remain in contact with them, that we're continuing to have coffee meetings with them, or sharing our story as it evolves with them. So if we had more time, we would do this part of the engagement cycle. But it's interesting to think about, we can brainstorm till the cows come home, or in the case of Tasmania, till the sheep come home. But it's actually being very intentional about how we engage people and taking it to the next level that will be a big predictor of success. Okay, I see other people coming into the room, so I've got to clear out. One final thing that I'm just going to share with you, and there we'll have some tools and resources out in your work. This is a critical thing as well in terms of collective impact, and that's your journey map. What are the pathways? What's the work that you're going to do over the next year, over the next 6 months? And drawing it out visually is a really great way to engage people. Okay, thank you very much.